Our Business from the Bench segment tonight. The Supreme Court is set to return to the bench next week. And late last week, the court announced it will hear what could be one of the biggest labor cases in the 21st century. This case involves public sector union employees being forced to pay dues to a union that uses that money for political activity that union members may or may not support. And the question is that constitutional? Or does that violate the First Amendment rights of the employees who are forced to pay those dues? With me now to break this down from the Freedom Foundation, Maxford Nelsen. Maxford, thanks for coming on the show.
My pleasure, Liz. Thanks for having me.
All right, this is kind of an interesting case, but it's also a little complicated for people who haven't followed labor law and labor Supreme Court rulings the past 30, 40, 50 years. So start from the very beginning for us and break this down. What is at stake here?
Sure. So this is fundamentally a case about the First Amendment rights, the free speech rights of public employees all across America. And if you go back to the 1960s and the 1970s, state laws allowed for public employees to unionize and collectively bargain. And a feature of most of those state laws was a requirement that these public employees join and pay dues to a labor union as a condition of keeping their jobs. And so as things stand now, certain states have since given the ability to public employees to make their own decisions about whether to join and financially support a union. But about 5 million employees, public employees in about 23 states currently are still required as a condition of keeping their jobs to every month pay dues to a labor union. Now this was challenged, the constitutionality of that practice was challenged back in the late 1970s. And in a case called Abood versus Detroit Board of Education, the Supreme Court actually said, yes, it is constitutional to force public employees to pay at least certain agency fees, is what the court called them, to a union. So the court tried to draw a line, if you will, between the types of activities that unions engage in. And it said, well, you can't be forced to subsidize your union's political contributions, perhaps, but you can be forced to pay for your union's representational activity. And so since that decision, the public employees have been able to jump through certain hoops to try and avoid supporting their union's explicitly political activity. But many of them still object to any financial obligation towards their union, and
Right.
That's really what this case gets to.
Right, and I mean, that makes sense. I mean, just talking about this case from 1977, I believe it was, the one that dealt with the constitutionality of forcing public sector union employees to pay dues. I mean, that seems to me, and I'm no expert in labor law here, but that seems to me an elementary violation of your First Amendment. If you're forced to pay dues to an organization that could use your money, your hard-earned money, to advocate for political beliefs that you disagree with, even if you use that vague separation that you just mentioned, where the Supreme Court said, well, that your money isn't being used for the political activity, just other people's money. It's still supporting the same organization. It's still giving life to that administration that fights for politics.
Yep, that's exactly right. And I think most Americans would agree with you that on its face, this is absolutely unjust to force people to pay dues to any private organization as a condition of keeping their jobs. And, you know, if you go back to the original decision, the 1977 case, you know, the state of Michigan and the unions involved in that decision argued that, yeah, sure, the First Amendment norm, if you will, is to not be able to force people to pay dues. But they argued that in this case, in this situation, the state's interest in preventing public employees from going on strike and disrupting government services justified that infringement of their rights.
Right, which is a scary proposition in and of itself, by the way, for the government to say it's in our interest so that our day-to-day activities run smoothly, that we infringe on a few of your rights. Terrifying. So talk to me about what's coming up. So this was just last Thursday, actually, that the Supreme Court announced that they would hear this case. What particularly is at stake here? Because it can't be the exact same case that we heard in 1977.
Right. Well, the court actually got very close to addressing this same issue 2 years ago in the Friedrichs versus California Teachers Association case. And at the time, court observers were pretty convinced that the court was going to overturn this requirement, the constitutionality of this requirement. And so we got to the point of hearing the oral argument in the case, but the untimely death of Justice Scalia left the court with a 4-4 deadlock in that decision. So now with a ninth justice, with Justice Gorsuch confirmed, the court looks like it's still interested in settling this question, and I think a lot of the unions are worried that this decision is not going to go their way.
Right, and that 4-4 deadlock that you're talking about, the 4 justices voting in favor, 4 against, because Justice Scalia had passed away, that made it revert back to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and we know how they always rule, so that's not a surprise. What do you expect from Gorsuch here? What is his history on labor law here? I mean, he seems fairly conservative, but do you expect it to be a 5-4 split?
I think that's probably the most likely outcome at this point, is that Justice Gorsuch will side with the other 4 justices that were ready to overturn these state laws the last time around. He's not addressed this question or even gotten quite close to this area of labor law based on his past jurisprudence that I'm aware of. But I think, again, most observers are fairly confident that he'll side with the First Amendment and that we'll get a 5-4 decision in favor of public employees' ability to make their own choice about whether to join a union or not.
All right, Maxford, we have less than 30 seconds, so make this answer as short as you possibly can. But I do want to ask you, I mean, this is not something that the unions are going to be happy about, not happy at all. What kind of reaction or lawsuits do you expect from them if the court rules against them?
Well, I think you'll see unions all over the country in the states where this is going to play out to try and cling to that compulsion as best as they can and trick people into signing up for union membership and waiving their rights in various ways. We've seen that in other states where this has played out. There's going to be a bitter fight in the courts on the ground in these states to make sure that public employees' freedom is actually protected. And that's a fight we're going to be looking forward to here at the Freedom Foundation.
Right, and I hope you'll come back and update us. This is a very interesting case. Maxford, thanks for being on the show. I appreciate it.